With a working mechanism for moving the Egg Wrecker, I needed to do something about the design of the ship to make it more appropriate for the new Eggman figure. I actually really like the design from the LEGO Ideas set, but the Eggman figure looks a little lost within it, and the size had also been a sticking point in my first attempt to move the ship. Eggman's torso is around 3 modules wide, so I wanted to aim to reduce the width by 1 module and reduce the length by 2 modules. I didn't want to need to seat the ship on round bricks or plates to connect it to an axle, so my first thought was a Technic plate to allow the axle to pass through the base, only this wouldn't allow me to narrow the ship down by much. LEGO system doesn't typically work in odd numbers, but Technic does, and I found a great potential connector that would not only allow for a 3 module wide base, but also provided an axle connection point and centered it within the length of the ship. As I wanted to reduce the length, I'd need to use shorter curved slopes, but this would mean having to invert the base. With reducing the width, I'd no longer be able to use the 1x4 arch brick covering the headlight at the front of the ship, but I couldn't picture any suitable alternatives to fill the more confined area. I didn't want to reduce the size of the light to a 1x1 tile, so I felt the best option was to fix it out in front. More frustratingly, the windscreen was also too wide, and again I couldn't picture any suitable elements to replace it, but I had a stroke of luck discovering that LEGO had actually created a 4 module wide variant. I could easily cut down some of the ship's length by removing a tile from the side of it, but moving the thruster was more difficult. As well as moving it inbound, I also wanted to reduce the size of it to help shorten the ship further, so I'd also have to remove or replace the rear wing and center both within 3 modules. The thruster could be fixed to a single brick, but the wing would need fixing to a jumper plate, which would be harder to fill in around as I'd be left with a half module or 1.25 plate depth gap either side of it. I looked at a few different wheels for the thruster, with only one of them really being suitable, but I still felt it was too thick, so I opted for a 2x2 dish instead. With elements now roughly in position, they all needed fixing together. I couldn't use the original modified 2x2 plates to fix the sides to the base, as the ship was now too narrow for 2 of them, but I discovered that the stud on a modified brick sat too high to fix into the side. LEGO had recently released a new modified brick with a stud much closer to the top edge, which I found to fit perfectly. The connections for the central console had to be stripped out, then I used a series of brackets, jumpers and a modified brick to connect the sides to the windscreen, console and headlight. This layout allowed me to leave Eggman's legs attached to his body when I'd originally considered removing them. Building up the front, I found I could fix Eggman in with a bracket, rather than finding a way to invert plates to connect to the back of his legs. At the rear of the ship, I wanted to replace the wing with something smaller. A double cheese slope by itself looked too small, so I tried a few other slopes. I quite liked this curved slope, except the flat edge needed more of an angle to it, which I didn't feel I could pull off here. But then I found a similarly curved element, which I felt worked well topped with the old double cheese slope. As the base of the ship was inverted, I'd have to use brackets to fix the tail to the ship, but I also needed to fit the back of Eggman's seat in there. I eventually found the best way to do this was building it sideways, then fixing the rear wing to it. The redesign was subtle but still significant, and Eggman looked a lot more comfortable in it. The new reduced length and width sadly still wasn't enough to give clearance from the backdrop, but I could now create a much shallower channel as I had for the platforms. Due to relative alignment of parts of the ship, the area wound up kind of large, but it should hopefully blend in with the rest of the blue sky. The Egg Wrecker was running pretty smoothly, but I wasn't really happy with how the rest of the project was running. There seemed to be a real struggle with moving the new platforms, despite having reduced gear ratios in a couple of places. I was planning to run the final battle on its own input, but I was now questioning whether I needed to run the tunnel and platforms on a separate input too. I had one last idea to try and save the situation, using a counterweight. This should, in theory, lessen the load on the mechanical system. Unfortunately, I didn't have space on the other side of the lifting gear for a counterweight, but I thought adding a second gear driven by the first might have the same effect. The platform plus slider weighed in at 68 grams, so I'd need to match this as closely as possible. I bought a few weighted bricks for the project several months earlier, but they were too heavy for this situation. There was, however, a new weighted element on the scene from a recent Technic set. Frustratingly, these elements don't have any physical connection points, so I'd have to build a cradle to hold the weight while being careful not to add too much extra weight to the weight. This was a bit of a challenge, as with the weight weighing in at 42 grams, I only had around 26 grams left for the cradle plus rack gear. It took a few reductions of frame sizes to create something that seemed to support the weight, and I threw together a frame to support and guide the counterweight and performed a test run. There we go. And we've broken things. Oh dear. It seemed I'd made a miscalculation. Looking back at the lifting gears, I realised they should have both been rotating in the same direction, and I'd effectively jammed the system trying to raise the platform already in its highest position. It was simple enough to fix, and this time I made sure I could move the mechanism manually before reinstalling the driver. The next test ran successfully, but after removing the counterweight for comparison, it really didn't feel any different. Before the next livestream, I noticed that the rack driving the tunnel mechanism was blocked by a support beam. It was only preventing a few millimeters of travel, but it would have been contributing to the difficulty in turning the input crank, so I had to rip open the framework and remove it. I did successfully unblock the blockage, but once everything was back together, felt like something somewhere was grinding. This whole livestream was kind of a disaster that I'd rather forget, but some good did come from it. Through becoming frustrated with repeatedly removing and reinstalling the backdrop, I decided to make a change. The backdrop was currently installed with Technic pins, which gave good security but were a pain to clip in. I'd been considering using axles instead, but was unsure of how securely they would hold, and if they weren't correctly oriented, would still be a pain to connect to. With having some free space behind the supporting lift arms, I could fix in thin lift arms with axle holes to keep the axles correctly oriented. Most of the Technic bricks in the backdrop would be easily replaced, but some of them did unfortunately need to be moved closer together due to limited lift arm lengths. The result was much easier to work with, and still appeared to be suitably secure.